The super wealthy have to pay their fair share.
Equity, wealth inequality, and tax the rich has become mainstream, with some politicians on the left, like AOC, who wore the slogan on her dress, and others like Bernie Sanders or Mamdani of New York, who's implementing ideology into economic consequences. It also brings up moral principles that one owns one's labor, no matter how successful, and that only they have the moral justification to use their stored wealth in other ways, including innovation, new market prospects, or whatever their dreams are. Principally, no social collective group has any moral standing to steal someone's labor in virtue of a third party, no matter what the arbitrary number. The old saying of buy low, sell high is misleading, because in a true free market system you buy low and sell it lower than your competitors. Wealth is not a pile of gold sitting idle in a vault, but a living network of incentives, investment, ownership, risk, discipline, and productive coordination. And when government attacks that network in the name of fairness, it often destroys the very system that raises living standards for everyone. The popular argument says, look how much the CEO makes, take it and give it to the workers. But the math exposes how shallow that idea is. Walmart CEO Doug McMillon's recent total compensation was about $27.4 million, while Walmart employs roughly 2.1 million people, meaning that even confiscating the CEO's entire annual compensation would amount to only about $13 per worker for the whole year. Not a serious improvement in anyone's life, while the leadership, coordination, logistics, capital allocation, and strategic decision-making behind a company of that size are precisely what help keep millions of people employed and billions of consumers supplied with cheaper goods. Economics is not about intentions, slogans, or emotional resentment. It is about incentives, trade-offs, and results. A high-earning executive, entrepreneur, investor, or founder is not merely taking money from society. In a functioning market, he is being rewarded because he helped organize labor, capital, technology, logistics, and consumer demand into something that people voluntarily use. If he fails, the market punishes him. If he succeeds, the reward looks enormous because the scale of the value created is enormous. Redistribution effectively destroys the incentives which created the wealth to begin with. The left-wing redistributionist view treats income as though it simply appears and then must be morally divided by politicians. But the free market view asks the prior question: who created the value? Who took the risk? Who built the system? Who satisfied the customer? Who has moral authority? And what happens if you punish that process? This is where the Laffer curve matters. Tax revenue does not rise mechanically forever as tax rates rise, because people change behavior. They work less, invest less, shelter more income, move capital elsewhere, delay realizing gains, relocate, hire fewer people, or stop taking risks. The Laffer curve's exact peak is debated, but its central lesson is undeniable. At a certain point, higher tax rates reduce the very taxable activity government is trying to harvest. Friedman's argument was not that the state should find the tax rate that extracts the most possible money from citizens. He argued that government should be limited, and he once suggested that a flat tax around 19% could collect more than the older, highly progressive system. The real question is whether ordinary people have better food, safer homes, longer lives, better medicine, cleaner water, smartphones, cars, air conditioning, refrigeration, cheap clothing, online education, and access to technologies that kings did not have a century ago. Globally, extreme poverty has fallen massively since 1990, with the World Bank noting a decline from around 2.3 billion people in extreme poverty to hundreds of millions today, largely because of economic growth, trade, productivity, and markets, not because bureaucrats made everyone equal. In the United States, real median household income was $83,730 in 2024, and the official poverty rate was 10.6%, meaning that even with real problems, the long-term capitalist trend is not the poor get poorer while the rich get richer, but that wealth, technology, and comfort spread downward over time. That is why obsessing over the gap between a cashier and Elon Musk misses the point. The cashier's life is improved more by cheaper goods, better logistics, better medicine, cheaper communication, better transportation, and new technology than by a one-time, symbolic confiscation of someone else's fortune. Musk is the clearest modern example. His wealth is mostly not cash, but ownership stakes in companies like Tesla, SpaceX, XAI, and related ventures. Bloomberg's Billionaire Index describes billionaire wealth as tied to valuation models and company stakes, not a checking account, and Reuters reported that Musk's wealth surged with SpaceX's valuation and his Tesla stake, showing how speculative and equity-based this wealth really is. If government tried to take it, it would have to force liquidation of stock or ownership, which could crash the value, damage investor confidence, weaken the companies, and harm workers, suppliers, contractors, and customers. Even if one imagines confiscating hundreds of billions from Musk, dividing it among Americans would be a one-time check of $1,000, not a permanent income stream, while the damage could hit hundreds of thousands of high-paying engineering jobs, manufacturing jobs, satellite jobs, AI jobs, battery jobs, launch jobs, contractor jobs, and millions involved in supply chains. The same applies to Bezos, Zuckerberg, Gates, and others. Their fortunes are mostly claims on companies that millions or billions of people use voluntarily, and many of these billionaires also give massive sums philanthropically. The Giving Pledge, for example, is a public commitment by many of the world's wealthiest people to give the majority of their wealth to charitable causes. Capitalism also drives the future in ways government planning rarely can. SpaceX lowered launch costs, Starlink is expanding global internet access, and the FCC approved SpaceX's plan for thousands more Starlink satellites to improve coverage and direct-to-cell capability, while AI systems like ChatGPT are accelerating productivity, education, coding, research, design, and communication. These breakthroughs happen because private actors can bet on uncertain futures with their own capital, move faster than bureaucracies, and accept failure without forcing taxpayers to fund every mistake. Government programs usually face political incentives, committee paralysis, budget waste, lobbying, union rules, regulatory drag, and use it or lose it spending habits. Nonprofits and municipalities can be inefficient for the same reason. Not seeking profit does not magically create discipline, accountability, or incentives. Profit is not greed, it's the margin between efficiency and competitive demand. Profit is a signal that resources are being used in a way people value more than the alternatives. Without profit and loss, organizations often lose the feedback mechanism that tells them whether they are creating value or merely consuming resources. That is why a nonprofit service or government-run system can easily become more expensive than a private one. The people spending the money are often not the people who earned it. The penalties for waste are weaker, and the incentive to innovate is duller. The same moral and economic problem appears in proposals to tax second homes, luxury property, or inheritance. A second home tax may sound like a punishment of the rich, but it can reduce property values, discourage maintenance, reduce local spending, drive away wealthy seasonal residents, hurt contractors, landscapers, restaurants, cleaners, and service workers, and ultimately shrink the tax base the town was trying to restore. Inheritance taxes are imposed because they are anti-family taxes. People who tax inheritance is to tell parents that as carefully as he spends his own. That investment will continue after investors are punished. That innovation will continue after innovators are demonized. That jobs will remain after capital is drained. And that government will spend money more wisely than the people who earned it. They believe that society created the system you work within, and that you have a social duty to share that wealth. Obfuscation is seen as undermining your forced moral duty. In reality, capitalism has done more to reduce scarcity, improve living standards, cheapen goods, expand opportunity, and push humanity into the modern age than any redistribution scheme ever invented. The moral case for free markets is the principle of owning your labor in the form of wealth, earned by voluntary exchange, private property, competition, innovation, and that personal responsibility produces better outcomes than envy backed by state power. The rich are not automatically immoral because they are rich. Inequality is not automatically injustice, and confiscation is not compassion. A society that rewards value creation gets more value creation. A society that punishes it gets less. Another main concern, which seems valid on the face of it, is that super wealth can buy political power. This is true. But you still end up with those who have plenty and are there in principle, and those who want more wealth and power. This is where practical rule of law applies, things like no inside trading, foundations which take pay for play, or enforcing existing laws. Having a system based upon a set of principles that come before social good or political overreach, revolving around individual freedom and a limited government, is exactly what the founders established to limit coercion. The American Constitution is the belief that human beings possess natural rights that exist prior to government itself, and that government is not the creator of rights, but merely their protector. Locke argued that every person is born with inherent rights to life, liberty, and property, and because those rights come from human nature, they cannot morally be taken away simply because a majority votes to do so. This is the crucial distinction between a constitutional republic and pure democracy. In a pure democracy, 51% of the population can theoretically vote away the freedoms of the other 49%, while in a Lockean constitutional system, there are principles and legal restraints that stand above temporary public passions, political movements, or ideological hysteria. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights were specifically designed to place chains on government power, because the founders understood that all concentrations of power eventually become dangerous, regardless of who holds them. James Madison famously argued in Federalist Number 51 that if men were angels, no government would be necessary, meaning that because humans are flawed, ambition and power must be checked structurally, rather than merely trusted morally. The Constitution, therefore, creates a system where power is fragmented intentionally. Legislative, executive, and judicial branches all possess different authorities and are capable of restraining one another through checks and balances, and the people themselves retain rights that government is forbidden from violating, even if it would be politically popular to do so. The Bill of Rights is especially important because it establishes negative liberties, meaning freedoms the government cannot interfere with, rather than benefits government promises to provide. The purpose of this framework is not efficiency or emotional satisfaction, but stability, restraint, and liberty. Democracies driven purely by public emotion often become unstable because temporary fear, envy, anger, or ideological movements can rapidly expand state power. History repeatedly shows this pattern. Majorities can support censorship during wartime, confiscation during economic crises, surveillance during periods of fear, and persecution during moral panics. The founders studied ancient democracies and understood that unrestricted majority rule often collapses into either mob rule or authoritarianism, because the public eventually votes itself benefits at the expense of productivity, property rights, or minority protections. The Constitution was therefore designed to slow politics down deliberately, forcing compromise and limiting sudden swings in power. This restraint is also tied directly to free market economics. Lockean principles hold that property rights are inseparable from liberty because if government controls the fruits of a person's labor, it ultimately controls the person himself. Economic freedom disperses power across millions of individuals instead of centralizing it in the hands of the state. In a free market, people voluntarily exchange goods and services according to mutual benefit, and success depends on satisfying consumers rather than pleasing political rulers. This creates decentralized decision-making, competition, innovation, and accountability. A business that wastes resources fails. A politician who wastes resources often receives a larger budget. Free markets therefore act as a restraint on political overreach, because they prevent the government from monopolizing economic life. When the state controls industries, healthcare, banking, energy, communication, or employment, citizens become dependent on political authorities for survival, which weakens resistance to tyranny. By contrast, widespread private ownership creates independent citizens who are economically capable of opposing the state, if necessary. This is why the founders and later classical liberals viewed free enterprise not merely as an economic system, but as a safeguard for political liberty itself. Milton Friedman later expanded this argument by explaining that economic freedom is a necessary condition for political freedom because centralized economic power eventually becomes centralized political power. A government large enough to control every aspect of the economy inevitably gains the ability to regulate speech, behavior, movement, employment, and dissent. The Constitution's separation of powers mirrors the market's separation of economic power. Both systems are built around decentralization because decentralization prevents domination. The checks and balances in government are essentially the political equivalent of competition in markets. No branch can fully dominate because another branch can resist it, just as no company can dominate consumers permanently if competitors exist. This structural limitation is one of the greatest achievements of constitutional government because it recognizes a timeless reality about human nature. Power expands whenever it is not restrained. A constitutional republic grounded in Lockean principles, therefore, does not trust politicians, majorities, bureaucracies, corporations, or even voters with unlimited authority. Instead, it creates enduring rules that protect individual liberty regardless of who temporarily holds power. The rule of law replaces the rule of men, meaning that principles are supposed to remain constant even when political moods change. This is why constitutional protections often matter most when they defend unpopular speech, unpopular groups, or unpopular ideas. Rights only truly exist if they survive moments of pressure. The American system assumes that freedom is fragile. Government power is always potentially dangerous, and liberty survives only when political authority is permanently restrained by law, decentralized institutions, private property, competing interests, and an armed, independent citizenry. The argument for tax the rich usually begins from a moral intuition. Extreme inequality can concentrate power, distort democracy, and leave ordinary people struggling while a small elite accumulates enormous wealth. Thinkers influenced by Karl Marx argue that wealth is not created in isolation. It depends on workers, infrastructure, social stability, and inherited systems. From this perspective, progressive taxation is not punishment, but reciprocity. Supporters believe public works is the foundation that allows capitalism itself to function, albeit dues already paid by individuals. They also argue that unchecked wealth can evolve into oligarchy, where corporations gain more influence than citizens, though their power is drastically limited without government favoritism, directives, or collusion. There is also a practical case. Markets can create extraordinary innovation, but they can also produce instability, monopolies, and exploitation if no limits or guardrails exist. But the counterargument, articulated by thinkers like Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell, begins with a different moral principle. The individual owns the product of his labor. In this view, freedom is inseparable from property rights. If the state can continually seize wealth simply because someone has too much, then rights become conditional, not inherent. This side argues that wealth is not a fixed pie. Innovation often comes from individuals who take enormous risks, build companies, and create technologies that eventually lower prices and improve life for millions. Figures like Elon Musk are used as examples of concentrated private wealth funding innovation in electric vehicles, reusable rockets, internet infrastructure, and AI. Systems rewarding success often produce abundance that benefits society broadly. Economists like Sowell also argue that equality of outcome is fundamentally incompatible with liberty. To guarantee equal results, governments must continuously intervene in voluntary exchange, regulate behavior, and centralize power. Historically, many societies that pursued economic equality aggressively ended up restricting speech, enterprise, movement, or dissent. The state grows because enforcing equality requires constant control. The strongest argument for freedom is not merely economic efficiency. It is protection against concentrated power itself. A free society protects unpopular minorities, dissenters, religious groups, innovators, and political outsiders precisely because rights belong to individuals, not collectives. Once government gains enough authority to redistribute without limit for the common good, that same authority can later be used against any minority group that falls out of political favor. The paradox is, unrestricted capitalism can concentrate economic power, but unrestricted state redistribution can concentrate political power. The question then becomes, which concentration of power is easier to escape? In a market society, a billionaire can fail, competitors can emerge, consumers can choose differently, and innovation can disrupt incumbents. But when power is centralized in the state, citizens cannot simply opt out. Governments possess coercive force, so a principled defense of liberty does not necessarily reject all taxation or all social welfare. Rather, it argues that preserving individual rights, voluntary exchange, free speech, private property, and limited government must remain the highest principle, because those protections ultimately safeguard everyone, especially dissenters and minorities. The greatest minority is the individual, The ultimate danger is not wealth itself or poverty itself. It is any system, corporate or governmental, powerful enough to remove the individual's freedom permanently. And usually corporate power only has teeth when government has the power to back it. A corporation, no matter how large, cannot imprison you, tax you, censor you, draft you, or seize your property on its own. To sustain real coercive power, corporations usually require government partnership through subsidies, regulations that block competitors, bailouts, lobbying influence, patents enforced by the state, or political favoritism. That's why the deeper danger is often not private wealth itself, but the merger of corporate and state power. A free market allows companies to fail, lose customers, and be replaced. But when government gains the power to pick winners and losers, corporations stop competing through innovation and start competing for political influence. The solution is not blind trust in corporations or blind trust in government. It is limiting concentrated power at its source. And government is the only institution with a legal monopoly on force.